And that's what I found that somewhat unsatisfactory about the figures, Mr. Nixon. In your previous speech, when you talked about the Truman administration.
Why, your family is paying the highest taxes in our history.
There is something paradoxical about power in America, a country founded in rejection of aristocracy, yet again and again drawn to political dynasties. And long before the motorcade in Dallas, long before the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a young man born into wealth, expectation, and pressure in Brooklyn in 1917. John F. Kennedy was not born into a struggle. He was born into ambition. His father, Joseph P. Kennedy, was a businessman, investor, and later U.S. ambassador in United Kingdom. Joseph Kennedy believed in power, not as an abstract idea, but as something to be built, defended, and expanded. He admired strength in politics and distrusted weakness. He reportedly once said, "When the going gets tough, the tough get going." He expected his son not merely to succeed, but to dominate. The Kennedy household was competitive, disciplined, and relentlessly strategic. Dinner table conversations were political. Victory was assumed. Originally, John was not meant to be political here. That role belonged to his older brother, Joseph Kennedy. Confident, charismatic, groomed national leadership. But history intervened. During World War II, John Kennedy served in the U.S. Navy in the Pacific Theater. In 1953, while commanding PT-109, a patrol torpedo boat, his vessel was struck by a Japanese destroyer. 2 crew members were killed. Kennedy, despite chronic back pain and fragile health, helped rescue surviving sailors, towing an injured man by gripping a life jacket strapped between his teeth during long swim to safety. The incident would later be politically useful, but at the time it was survival. It reshaped the Kennedy family's future in another way. Joseph Jr. was killed in 1944 during a hazardous bombing mission over Europe. The political future of the family shifted overnight. John became the vessel of expectation. In 1956, Kennedy ran for Congress in Massachusetts. He was young, 29 years old, Catholic, wealthy, and Irish-American family. At the time, Catholicism in national politics still raised suspicion. In a predominantly Protestant political culture, many quietly wondered, could a Catholic president truly separate church and state? Kennedy understood the hesitation. Years later, during his 1916 presidential campaign, he addressed it directly in Houston. "I believe in an America where separation of church and state is absolute." He was not merely defending his faith, he was defending electability. Kennedy entered the Senate in 1953. He was not immediately dominant. He was cautious, methodical, observant. In 1956, he narrowly missed becoming the Democratic vice presidential nominee. He learned something from that defeat. Image mattered, television mattered, presence mattered. His book, Profiles in Courage, which won a Pulitzer Prize, elevated his intellectual credibility, though historians still debate how much he personally authored. But politically, it worked. He was no longer just a young senator, he was national. By the late 1950s, the United States was powerful, but uneasy. The Cold War distracted everything.
Enemy targets.
The Soviet Union had launched Sputnik in 1957. Suddenly, America felt technologically vulnerable. The fear was not just military, it was symbolic. Was the US falling behind? At home, racial segregation still shaped southern states. The civil rights movement was gathering momentum. Internationally, the colonization was reshaping Africa and Asia. The world was unstable.
Senator Kennedy and his pretty wife arrived at the polling place early on election day.
And in 1916, Kennedy ran for president against Vice President Richard Nixon.
Kennedy, 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 Kennedy.
Do you want a man for president who's seasoned through and through, but not so doggone seasoned that he won't try something new? A man who's old enough to know
And young enough to do.
well, it's up to you, it's up to you. It's strictly
The televised, debated become history. On radio, many believed Nixon won. On television, Kennedy appeared composed, controlled, confident.
The United States. Well, I would say in the latter that and that's what I found somewhat unsatisfactory about the figures, Mr. Nixon, that you used in your previous speech. When you talked about the Truman administration, Mr. Truman came to office in 1944 and at the end of the war, and for 7.5 years. And comparing him to the last 8 years, I prefer to take...
The medium itself had changed politics. Kennedy understood modern optics before many of his rivals did. The election was close, very close. Kennedy won by a narrow popular vote margin, one of the tightest in American history. At 47, he became the youngest elected president in U.S. history. But victory did not bring stability. Behind the scenes, intelligence briefings were already warming the fragile situation in Cuba.
Every man, woman, and child lives under a nuclear sword of Damocles.
Berlin was tense. Nuclear arsenals were expanding, and inside Washington, some senior military leaders questioned whether the young president who would grasp the stakes his inaugural rule would become famous. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. It sounded confident, forward-looking, but confidence and control are not the same thing. Once he will face a test that will widely shape how both allies and enemies judged him. And in that moment, the image of youth and energy would collide. The unforgiving machinery of Cold War geopolitics. Collision is where the real presidency begins. There is a difference between winning an election and commanding a superpower. When John F. Kennedy entered the White House in January 1961, he carried youth, charisma, and the momentum, but he did not yet fully control the machinery of American power. The CIA, the Pentagon, the Cold War logic inherited from Dwight Eisenhower, and within weeks that machinery would move. In April 1961, the United States backed a CIA plan to invade Cuba and overthrow Fidel Castro. The assumption inside parts of Washington was simple: Cuban exiles land. The Cuban population rises, Castro falls. But assumptions are not a strategy. The landing at the Bay of Pigs failed catastrophically. Cuban forces crushed the invasion within days. Kennedy had approved the operation, though it was largely planned before he took office. The failure exposed something dangerous. He was president, but he was not yet in command of the system. Privately, Kennedy took responsibility. Victory has hundreds of fathers, and defeat is an orphan. The code was his, and it signaled something important. He had been tested, and he had learned. Inside Moscow, Nikita Khrushchev watched closely. A young president, an embarrassing failure, perhaps inexperience. That perception would matter. In June 1961, Kennedy met Khrushchev in Vienna. The summit did not go well. Khrushchev pressed aggressively over Berlin. Kennedy appeared strained. Afterward, Kennedy reportedly told an aide he beat the hell out of me. Berlin was the next flashpoint. These Germans were filling West Berlin in large numbers, a humiliation for the Soviet bloc. In August 1961, construction began on what would become the Berlin Wall. Concrete and barbed wire divided the city and symbolized a divided world. Kennedy did not intervene militarily. Some critics saw weakness, others saw restraint. War in Berlin could escalate instantly, and both sides possessed nuclear weapons. By 1962, the United States and the Soviet Union each had thousands of nuclear warheads. Intercontinental ballistic missiles, strategic bombers, submarines. Mutually assured destruction was not yet a formed doctrine, but the logic was emerging. The Pentagon had operational plans that included massive retaliatory strikes. Generals believed the strength prevented the war. Diplomats feared miscalculation would solve on. Kennedy sat between those pressures. He increased defense spending, expanded special forces, approved missile deployment in Turkey. But he was also increasingly wary of automatic military escalation. The lesson of the Bay of Pigs lingered. Then came the moment. U.S. reconnaissance flights photographed Soviet nuclear missile sites under construction in Cuba. Missiles capable of striking Washington, New York, much of the eastern United States within minutes. The intelligence was clear. Khrushchev had altered the strategic balance. Kennedy convened a secret advisory group, the XCOM. The options presented were stark. Airstrike the missile sites, invade Cuba, or impose a naval blockade. Many military leaders pushed for immediate air attack. They feared delay signaled weakness. Kennedy hesitated. An airstrike might not destroy our missiles, and if even one survived. Escalation would be unstoppable. He chose what they called a quarantine, a naval blockade to prevent further missiles from reaching Cuba. It was a gamble. The world held its breath.
October 22nd, 1962, President John F. Kennedy broadcast a special message to the nation from his office in the White House. Here is President Kennedy as he delivered that message, bearing on recent events in Cuba.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Upon receiving the first preliminary hard information of this nature, Last Tuesday morning at
For
9
13 days, the United States and the Soviet Union stood on the edge of nuclear war. At one point, a US U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba. Pressure mounted to retaliate. Privately, Kennedy estimated the odds of nuclear war as between 1 in 3 and even. That is not rhetoric, that is calculation. In Moscow, Khrushchev faced his own pressure, military hardliners, questions of credibility. Both leaders need to avoid humiliation. Both needed to avoid annihilation. In the end, a deal emerged. The Soviet Union would withdraw missiles from Cuba. The United States would secretly remove missiles from Turkey and pledged not to invade Cuba. Publicly, Kennedy appeared strong. Privately, it was compromise. But compromise preserved survival. Years later, Kennedy would say, "Let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate." The crisis changed him. He had stared into the machinery of nuclear war and stepped back. After the missile crisis, Kennedy's rhetoric softened. In June 1963, at American University, he delivered a speech calling for re-examination of US-Soviet relations. For, in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. It was subtle, but it signaled movement away from permanent confrontation. The limited nuclear test ban treaty followed in 1963, a small step but symbolic. Domestically, pressure was building. The civil rights movement intensified. Images from Birmingham, police dogs and firehouses turned on black demonstrators, shocked the nation. Kennedy had been cautious on civil rights early in his presidency. He needed Southern Democrats in Congress. But by 1963, the moral weight was unavoidable. He proposed major civil rights legislation. He knew it would fracture political alliances. But he also knew delay was no longer sustainable. America itself was divided. Cold War abroad, civil unrest at home. And Kennedy stood in the middle, balancing idealism and political survival. By late 1963, he was planning a re-election campaign. The economy was improving, the nuclear temperature had cooled. But political opposition remained intense. Texas was politically volatile. And in November 1963, a trip was scheduled to Dallas. A routine political visit. At least that is how it was presented. History rarely announces its turning points in advance. Sometimes they arrive on an ordinary afternoon. After, when they do, everything after them feels different. By November 1963, John F. Kennedy was no longer the inexperienced president of 1961. He had survived the Bay of Pigs, he had negotiated the Cuban Missile Crisis. He had begun repositioning America's nuclear posture. He had introduced civil rights legislation that would later domestic politics for generations. He was preparing for re-election. And yet, beneath the optimism of late 1963, tensions lingered. The Cold War had not ended. Cuba remained communist. The Soviet Union remained armed. Vietnam was slowly escalating. US advisors were already in place. The civil rights struggle was intensifying in the South. America was stable but not calm. Dallas was politically complicated. Texas Democrats were divided between liberals and conservatives. Kennedy's trip was meant to unify faction ahead of the 1964 campaign. The motorcade route passed through downtown Dallas, including Dealey Plaza. Shortly after 12:13 p.m., shots were fired. Within hours, the president was dead. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn in a broad Air Force One. The official investigation conducted by the Warren Commission concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. But history did not end with that conclusion. In many ways, it began there. Oswald, a former Marine who had defected to the Soviet Union and later returned to the United States, was arrested shortly after shooting. He denied involvement and just passed it. 2 days later, he was shot and killed by nightclub owner Jack Ruby while in police custody. The moment, broadcast live on television, transformed suspicion into permanent uncertainty. Because once the accused is dead, questions multiply. Over the decades, multiple explanations have circulated. Some overlap, some contradict. None have raised doubt. The Warren Commission maintained that Oswald fired 3 shots from the Texas school book depository. Supporters argue ballistics evidence matched his rifle. He had a history of political radicalism. He had previously attempted political violence. To them, the assassination was the act of troubled individual seeking historical significance. But for many Americans, the event felt too large for one man. Some speculate have elements within the CIA may have been involved. Why would people think this? Because Kennedy had clashed with intelligence leadership after the Bay of Pigs. He reportedly expressed frustration with the agency. Critics later claimed he intended to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces. Additionally, covert operations against Cuba had created complex networks of anti-Castro militant intelligence, assessed and secret missions. Was there resentment? Was there institutional anger? Some believe so. There is no definite proof, but the suspicion persists. Others point outward. Kennedy had authorized covert action against Castro. The Cuban Missile Crisis humiliated Khrushchev domestically. Could retaliation have followed? Supporters of this theory point to Oswald's time in the Soviet Union and his pro-Castro sympathies, yet historians often caution. Direct state-sponsored assassination of US president would have risked a nuclear war. Would Moscow or Havana take the risk? Conclusive evidence has proven they did. The 1960s were already a decade of upheaval. Within 5 years of Kennedy's death, his brother Robert Kennedy would be assassinated. Martin Luther King Jr. would be assassinated. The Vietnam War would expand dramatically. Trust in government institutions began to erode. The Warren Commission's conclusions satisfied some, but not all. Subsequent investigation repented questions, but did not settle them completely. For Americans alive in 1963, the assassination felt like a rupture. Television had brought the presidency into living rooms. Now it brought tragedy. Author Don DeLillo once wrote of that day, "It is impossible to overestimate the importance of that afternoon. It was not just about the president, it was about innocence, about whether power in America was stable or fragile. Under President Lyndon Johnson, civil rights legislation passed. The Vietnam War escalated. The Cold War continued. History moved forward, but differently. Some argue Kennedy might have reduced involvement in Vietnam. Others argue containment policy would have prevailed regardless. What is certain is this: after Dallas, the tone of American politics shifted. Optimism died, the skepticism grew, and the image of Kennedy, young, confident, composed during crises, froze in time, not as a finished presidency, but as a possibility interrupted. Sometimes history turns gradually, and sometimes turns in a single echoing moment, in a city street, under a clear Texas sky. What might have followed remains one of the 20th century's enduring questions. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget about like and following us. What is your opinion about Kennedy's assassination? Tell us in the comments.